Let me tell you about a first-second combined class rule. So that becomes our point of departure, what real learning looks, some snapshots. Let me tell you about a first-second combined classroom in Massachusetts, where the kids had been studying the Mayflower on an ongoing basis, and one day arrived at school in the morning to find that all their chairs and tables had been pushed to the corners of the room, and on the floor was an enormous ship in masking tape. They were naturally buzzing with curiosity, and once everybody had arrived, the teacher explained that this was, in fact, the Mayflower, the very ship that they had been studying. And on cue, in comes, dressed up, one of the kids from the class named Zeb, who was carrying a scroll. And he read from the scroll, "This is a note from the king." And the king says, "We can't go on the ship until we know how big it is." "Okay," says the teacher to the class, "we have to figure out some way of knowing how large this ship is. Anybody have any ideas?" Long, painful silence. The kind that the teacher later reported was enough to make her reconsider whether this was a wise thing to have done in the first place. Finally, one kid speaks up, a kid named Tom, and he says, "Well, it can't be 3 feet, because the nurse measured me, and I'm 4 feet, and the boat's smaller than me. I mean, bigger than me. The boat's bigger than me." Okay, now this gets kids talking. They start offering ideas, and somebody says, "Why don't we measure how many times Tom can fit in the ship?" Tom is happy to volunteer for this assignment. So they measure it and find that the boat is about 4 Toms long. "Okay, we've done it." "That's great," says the teacher, "except for one problem. The king has never met Tom. How will he know what that means?" She waits for somebody to supply the information that Tom just told us he's 4 feet tall. And nobody says it. Does the teacher supply this information? No. The best teachers have teeth marks on their tongues. They talk about some other possibilities, and finally somebody says, "I heard that you can measure horses with hands. Why don't we measure it with hands?" The kids rush to do this. One kid in particular named Mark, and he does it, and then he does it again and gets 2 different answers. With a lot of advice, he finally gets the idea you really have to start just at one end of the boat and leave no space in between your hands. Does it several times, gets the same answer each time. The boat is about 36 hands long. "We did it," they say. Teacher says, "That's great. But just to be sure, Sue," she's the smallest kid in the class, could you do this too?" And Sue measures it, and now the boat is 42 hands long. Chaos, animated discussion. The kids have realized that all hands on deck are not of equal length. What can we do about this? Well, by now they've taken up quite a bit of time, and they have to move on to music or something like that. So what does the teacher do about the fact that they've run out of time? She says, "We're not done. Real learning takes time. So we'll come back to it tomorrow," whether she had planned that or not. Because learning, not the schedule, real learning, not coverage of a prefabricated curriculum, matters the most in that classroom. It turns out that delaying the rest of this one night was a good idea, because a kid came up with a brainstorm overnight. He said, "We could do it with feet." And so they start to measure it with their feet, but find that here, too, there's a difference between the biggest and the smallest kid. And now another kid has a brainstorm. "Why don't we measure it with Zeb's feet? After all, the king knows Zeb. He gave him the note." So they measure it in units of Zeb's feet. And they reach a satisfying answer, and now the kids want to measure other things in the room in units of Zeb feet, which the teacher is happy to let them do. Only on the 3rd day, returning again to this topic, does the teacher for the first time introduce the concept of standard units of measurement. And only after that does she give them rulers. Pretend you have just been watching this lesson over 3 days. Do me a favor. Turn to somebody sitting near you, preferably somebody you don't know, so that could be somebody sitting in the row behind you or in front of you. Say hi, introduce yourself quickly, and then take a minute and a half, no more than that, to see if the two of you can come up with something that you noticed in this classroom during this lesson that struck you as interesting, as perhaps remarkable, unusual, compared to the way math is taught or other subjects are taught, not only at that grade level, but at any grade level. Say hello. All right, I'm going to reconvene you, if I may. Can we get just a few items on the table that you may have come up with? If you can simplify, if you can distill to a sentence, a phrase, even a word, what did you and your partner, or you or your partner, notice that went on in this classroom that struck you? Yes?
The teacher provided an opportunity for the students to inquire further.
An opportunity for the students to inquire further, and as opposed to it being sort of limited. It's just here, that's the point, you do this. What else? Thank you. Something else? Yes?
The teacher allowed the classroom to be a bit messy.
Because learning is messy. Because deep learning is really messy. New York State standards are nothing if not orderly. Start to see a problem? Yes? The kids were free to say what was on their mind without worrying whether it was right or wrong. One query to think about, was that just because she was a patient, supportive personality? Or might it have been also because the lesson was about exploring ideas rather than getting the right answer? So there was something pedagogical, not just personality related, that might have given them that freedom. In other words, even a really nice teacher who has worksheets where the point is to produce the right answer is unlikely to create a safe environment. Interesting to think about. Yeah? She did more listening than talking, which is true of the best teachers. Most of the time in great classrooms, the kids are doing most of the talking, including in high school. Yeah?
There was no formal test for assessment.
There was no formal test or assessment, at least part of this vignette, right? Presumably, if there was some assessment at the end of this unit on standard units of measurement, it would not have taken the form of a test, since that would be inconsistent with the depth of learning that went on, because a test would just test whether they knew how many, inches were in a foot or something like that. This is a classroom about learning, not memorizing facts. What else? Or if the administrator did come in, she knew how to finesse that. I must digress to tell you my favorite story about this. A science teacher was given a bunch of workbooks to use, And she said, thank you very much, and put them away in the closet and closed the door and proceeded with her curriculum, which was about discovery-oriented, not memorizing principles of magnetism or whatever, or facts about the planets, but helping the kids think like scientists. But one day, the principal came in, looked around, and his smile vanished when he said, where are the workbooks? And she said, oh, don't worry, they're safe in the closet. He said, in the closet? You've got to use them. She said, I've got to use them? Yes, you've got to use them, said the principal. And so she reported, we used them. We weighed them dry, and we weighed them wet. I love that story. Yes. Oh, anything else? Yeah.
It doesn't sound like the teacher's particularly concerned with measurable objectives.
No, she's not concerned with measurable objectives because she knows, as Linda McNeil at Rice University in Houston said, measurable outcomes may be the least significant results of learning. That's a quotation I would love to see principals and superintendents and chancellors copy down and then print out in 42-point Helvetica and frame. Measurable outcomes may be the least important results of learning. That's a comment like Linda Darling Hammond's that indicates real understanding about learning. The kind of folks who talk about specific, measurable standards thereby reveal their ignorance about real learning. Because after all, think about it in terms your neighbor who's not an educator can understand. It's a hell of a lot easier to measure the number of semicolons used correctly in an essay than it is to measure the number of wonderful ideas in an essay. The more focused you are on measurable outcomes, the more trivial your teaching tends to become. The people who don't understand that are the corporate managers running the school districts. Let's make sure we at least understand how little they know, rather than becoming accomplices in their ignorance. One more. What'd you notice?
It was
A
a cooperative experience.
cooperative. It was not only active learning, it was interactive learning, which is the default setting in great classrooms. Most of the time, kids are learning with and from one another in great classrooms, not stationed on separate desks. You know, learning what one person said years ago, Philip Jackson said, was the central lesson of American elementary schools: how to be alone in a crowd. They're learning with each other. And what are they learning? Yeah, you have something? Trusted their process. In fact, not only trusted the process, but privileged process over product, in a way you might even say, but also their process. Notice, too, that what they were doing, I mean, it was a hands-on lesson, to be sure. But it was not just a hands-on lesson. I once was in a 6th grade classroom where the kids were, the teacher was really proud of her hands-on lesson, which consisted of gluing cotton balls onto a sheet of paper to represent different kinds of clouds, after which they had to memorize the difference between cumulus and cirrus and so on. This was a minds-on lesson, too. These kids were grappling with the idea of a ruler. How many teachers would have just given kids rulers and said, go measure stuff? And said, look, I'm doing hands-on learning. These kids were inventing rulers, in effect. This is real thinking of the kind that you don't often find. All right, that's an elementary school lesson. And there's more to be said about the choices this teacher... By the way, one thing you didn't catch this teacher doing ever was going, good job. I really like the way you came up with such a great suggestion. That kind of verbal doggy biscuit is a way of shutting down thinking. But that's a whole nother lecture.